Some cities grow because people need them. Others are built on the belief that people will come. In Inner Mongolia, China, Kangbashi was planned for 1 million residents. Today, it has about 10,000. Fueled by coal wealth, the city rose almost overnight. Wide boulevards, monumental government buildings, cultural landmarks, and rows of high-rise apartments. Everything built for a crowd that never arrived. Walk its streets, and you see the scale of the dream and the emptiness it left behind. Fountains run without an audience. Playgrounds sit silent, except for swings creaking in the wind. At night, most windows stay dark. This isn't just about empty streets. It's about the optimism, the economics, and the psychology of overbuilding, and what happens when vision outpaces reality. This is Kangbashi's story. A city stretches as far as the eye can see. Wide boulevards cut through blocks of high-rise apartments. Public squares hold bronze statues. A modern library towers over an empty plaza. But instead of the hum of traffic or the chatter of crowds, there's only the sound of the wind moving between the buildings. This is Kangbashi in Inner Mongolia, China. It was built to house hundreds of thousands. Today, only about 10,000 people live here. Kangbashi sits near Ordos, a region that grew rich from coal and rare earth mining. In the early 2000s, local officials wanted to turn that wealth into a showcase city. They planned cultural landmarks, expansive parks, and thousands of new apartments. The aim was to attract professionals, investors, and tourists. On paper, it was a vision of progress. In reality, most of those apartments remain dark at night. Schools stand half full. Shopping centers open their doors each morning to empty corridors. Walking through the central district, you see 8-lane roads with no cars. Buses arrive on schedule to pick up a handful of passengers. Streetlights blink on at dusk, lighting sidewalks where no one walks. At the city's stadium, built for tens of thousands of fans, the seats hold only a few scattered spectators for a local game. It is the scale of the infrastructure that makes the emptiness so vivid. The reasons lie in both economics and timing. The construction boom began when China's real estate market was surging. Developers believed buyers would flock to the city as industries grew, but many apartments were sold as investments, not homes. People bought them expecting prices to rise, not intending to move in. When the mining industry slowed and job opportunities failed to materialize, the migration never came. The city remained a shell, full of buildings, but short on residents. Overbuilding is not unique to Kangbashi. Cities around the world have seen similar patterns when development outpaces demand. In Spain, entire suburban tracts sat unfinished after the 2008 financial crisis. In the United States, parts of Nevada saw rows of foreclosed homes after the housing bubble burst. But in Kangbashi, the difference is the scale and speed. The city's infrastructure was completed almost all at once, rather than growing gradually with its population. That left vast spaces ready for people who never arrived. Picture yourself as one of the 10,000 who do live here. Your morning commute takes you down a multi-lane avenue where you might pass 3 cars. You stop for coffee at a shop that opens mostly for regulars, not walk-in traffic. At night, your apartment window looks out over dozens of other towers, their dark windows reflecting the streetlights. You might feel both privileged, having so much space, and isolated, knowing the city around you was built for a crowd that isn't here. The emptiness creates unusual challenges. Businesses struggle to stay open with so few customers. Public services operate at a fraction of their intended capacity. A library with shelves for hundreds of visitors each day might see only a handful. Parks and plazas remain pristine because they are barely used. Even basic social life is harder to sustain when neighbors live scattered across wide areas. Yet Kangbashi's story is not only about miscalculation. It also reflects a particular mindset in urban planning, building for the future before the future arrives. In regions flush with capital, there's a belief that development will attract demand. The idea is simple. If you build housing, jobs, and amenities now, people will come later. In some cases, that works. In others, like Kangbashi, the gap between construction and population growth becomes a long pause rather than a short wait. There is also the psychology of ownership to consider. In China, property is seen as a key form of wealth. Many families buy real estate even if they don't live in it, treating it like a savings account. In a city like Kangbashi, that means many apartments have owners but no occupants. From a satellite view, the city looks complete, roads paved, buildings standing, but the life inside those structures never starts. The economic backdrop matters too. The wealth from Ordos's mining boom was temporary. When coal prices fell and environmental rules tightened, the revenue that had fueled the city's growth slowed. Without a steady flow of new jobs, there was little to anchor a large incoming population. The same buildings that had been an emblem of prosperity became reminders of a gamble that had yet to pay off. Standing in Kangbashi's central square, it's possible to feel both awe and unease. The city has art installations, fountains, and landscaping that rival any major urban center. But the absence of people shifts the mood. Spaces designed for interaction, amphitheaters, promenades, food courts, lose part of their meaning without a crowd. The quiet is not the same as peace. It is a silence born from absence. The city's planners argue that Kangbashi's population will grow over time. They point to small increases in residents over the past few years and to government offices that have relocated there. They see the empty streets not as a failure, but as a stage set for a future performance. Whether that performance will ever begin is uncertain. Economic cycles, migration trends, and changing industries will decide. For now, Kangbashi remains a rare sight, a fully formed city with more buildings than people to use them. It is a reminder that ambition can shape skylines, but it cannot guarantee the human activity those skylines were meant to hold. It stands as an example of how urban landscapes can be built faster than the communities they are meant to serve. In its quiet streets and empty plazas, you can see the outlines of both a dream and a cautionary tale. In the 1990s, Inner Mongolia was known to most people in China as a remote northern region with grasslands, herders, and a few industrial towns. That image began to change when large coal deposits were developed on a massive scale. Mines expanded, rail lines lengthened, and energy companies set up operations across Ordos, the prefecture where Kangbashi would later rise. The demand for coal was high, driven by China's rapid industrial growth. Prices surged, and local revenues swelled. By the early 2000s, the coal boom had transformed the local government's finances. Tax income from mining companies gave city planners and officials a kind of spending power rarely seen outside the richest coastal provinces. The region's leaders looked to other parts of China where urban skylines had grown seemingly overnight. They wanted to match that speed and scale, but also to prove that a city in Inner Mongolia could be as modern and impressive as anything in Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen. The vision they formed was not modest. They spoke openly of building a city for 1 million residents. The figure had both practical and symbolic value. Practically, it matched projections for future population growth if the mining economy kept expanding. Symbolically, it placed Ordos in the same category as China's largest and most developed urban centers. We will build not just a place to live, but a place to inspire, one senior official was quoted saying in a local newspaper in 2004. Kangbashi will be our calling card to the world. The money allowed for a bold approach. Rather than letting the city grow in stages, they would build its core in one concentrated effort. Blocks of high-rise apartments, each with hundreds of units, went up in tight succession. Wide boulevards were laid out to accommodate future traffic. Utilities were installed at a capacity far beyond the existing needs. The aim was to have the infrastructure in place long before the people arrived. Urban design became a point of pride. The city's cultural squares were designed as grand public stages, surrounded by fountains, sculptures, and landscaped gardens. An opera house with a sweeping glass facade was planned to anchor the cultural district. Monumental government buildings, with columns and imposing staircases, would line the administrative quarter. The central library was designed to rival the best in the country, with enough space to hold millions of volumes. Planners studied the layouts of Paris, Canberra, and Washington, D.C., looking for ways to combine ceremonial grandeur with modern efficiency. Investors shared the excitement. Many came from outside Inner Mongolia, drawn by the promise of a next frontier for real estate growth. In Beijing, prices are already high, one developer told a trade magazine in 2006. Here, you can buy early, watch the city fill up and see values rise year after year. Apartments sold quickly on paper, even though few buyers intended to live in them immediately. For many, the purchase was an investment tied to faith in the coal economy's strength. The coal wealth fed that faith. In those years, Ordos was producing more coal than almost any other region in China. Exports to other provinces brought in steady cash flow. Employment in mining and related industries seemed secure. People in surrounding towns believed the boom would last for decades. New roads linked the mines to the city, and freight trains carrying coal rumbled through the night. The sense of prosperity was strong enough to make the idea of a 1 million-person city seem not only possible, but inevitable. City planners spoke in terms of destiny. One urban designer recalled in an interview years later, "We believed we were building the heart of a future metropolis. The land was here, the money was here, and the will was here." Renderings showed the city's districts glowing under streetlights, filled with cars, pedestrians, and outdoor cafes. Official brochures promised theaters with international performances, museums with national treasures, and sports arenas hosting large tournaments. On the ground, construction moved at remarkable speed. Crews worked through winter cold to pour concrete and set steel frames. Landscaping teams planted rows of trees along new avenues. Public art installations were commissioned from sculptors across China. Every detail aimed to signal that Kangbashi was more than a mining town. It was the centerpiece of a new urban era for the region. Government leaders saw political value as well. A city of this scale would put Ordos on the national map, bringing attention and influence. Hosting conferences, exhibitions, and cultural festivals would attract visitors and media coverage. When you build big, you think big. One official told a group of reporters during a site tour in 2007, "We are showing what Inner Mongolia can achieve." For residents moving in during the early years, the city felt like a promise in motion. They could rent spacious apartments for reasonable prices. Roads were wide, and parking was plentiful. Public buildings were clean and new. "I thought we were lucky to get in early," a schoolteacher remembered. Everything was fresh. You could feel the energy of something beginning. Behind that optimism was a simple economic equation. Coal revenue would fund the city until its own population and industries could sustain it. That assumption rested on coal prices staying high and demand staying steady. At the time, there was little reason to think otherwise. China's economy was expanding at a pace that seemed unstoppable, and coal was still the dominant energy source. By the late 2000s, most of the major civic projects were complete. The Opera House stood ready to host performances. The main government plaza was landscaped and lit. Apartment complexes stretched across the skyline. Planners marked off land for future schools, hospitals, and shopping districts, confident they would be needed soon. In aerial photographs, Kangbashi looked like a thriving metropolis in the making. Even those who had doubts kept them quiet. The atmosphere of the time rewarded boldness and punished hesitation. Developers who questioned whether enough people would move in risked being seen as lacking vision. Officials who pushed for slower growth could be accused of holding back progress. "If you build for the future, you can't be timid," one project manager told a local television crew in 2008. "We will fill these buildings. It's only a matter of time." The coal boom had not only paid for the city's construction, but also shaped the psychology behind it. Mining wealth created a sense that resources were limitless, that infrastructure could be built first and filled later. The experience of other Chinese cities, where population often caught up with construction in just a few years, reinforced that belief. In this context, a 1 million resident target was not a gamble. It was seen as the natural outcome of smart planning and good timing. From the start, Kangbashi was meant to be a statement as much as a settlement. Its broad avenues, public monuments, and cultural landmarks were built to show what the region could achieve when its wealth was turned inward. In the words of a senior planner at the groundbreaking ceremony, "We are laying the foundation for a city that will stand for 100 years. This is not just for us, but for our children and grandchildren." The coal trains kept running, the money kept coming in, and the city kept rising, floor by floor, plaza by plaza, toward a future its builders could already see in their minds. The plan for Kangbashi moved forward with a simple belief: if you build the city, people will come. Officials and developers repeated it often. It was both a rallying cry and a shield against doubt. Cities, they said, should be ready before the crowds arrive. Waiting for demand to grow first would mean missing the moment. Financing came from three main sources. The local government issued bonds, using future tax revenues as collateral. Developers took out large loans from state-owned banks, confident that rising property values would make repayment easy. And the coal industry, still at its peak, poured profits into real estate. Mining companies bought land, funded construction projects, and sometimes even built housing blocks themselves, expecting to rent or sell them later. The money flowed quickly enough that construction could happen on multiple sites at once. Every new district had its own unveiling. Streets were swept, banners hung, and stages set up for grand opening ceremonies. Local leaders stood under red canopies to cut ribbons in front of freshly painted buildings. Folk dancers performed in the plazas and fireworks lit the sky. The message was that Kangbashi was open for business. Real estate expos became a regular event. Developers set up booths with scale models of apartment towers, complete with tiny cars parked in front and miniature trees lining the sidewalks. Sales agents handed out glossy brochures showing happy families in sunlit parks and children riding bicycles along clean boulevards. Prospective buyers toured finished show units, where every room was staged with new furniture, untouched appliances, and neatly folded towels in the bathrooms. Advertising campaigns appeared in regional newspapers and on television. One ad showed a couple standing on a balcony at sunset, looking out over the city's wide avenues. The slogan promised, "Your future begins here." Another focused on the city's public amenities: a library with marble floors, an opera house with world-class acoustics, and sports stadiums ready for competition. The ads didn't mention that many of these facilities would open to small audiences, if any at all. The pace of construction was relentless. Cranes moved across the skyline. Cement mixers lined the roads. The sound of jackhammers, welding, and truck engines filled the air from morning until late evening. Whole neighborhoods rose in the space of a year. Landscaping crews planted trees so young that their trunks were held upright by wooden supports. At the peak of building, it seemed like the city's population might double overnight. In those years, Kangbashi's approach resembled that of Brasilia in the 1960s. The Brazilian capital was also built almost all at once, on a remote plateau far from existing urban centers. Its wide avenues and monumental buildings came before the people to use them. At first, Brasilia struggled with emptiness, and many predicted it would never fill. It eventually did, but only after decades. For Kangbashi, the lesson from Brasilia was clear. Building ahead of demand could work, but it required patience and sustained economic growth. Inside Kangbashi's government offices, optimism still dominated. Reports projected steady migration from rural areas. Developers planned their next phases, pointing to rising property prices as proof the market was healthy. Coal companies kept investing in land, treating it as a secure asset. The idea that the city might sit half-empty for years was discussed, but it was framed as a temporary phase, not a risk to the entire project. In the early days after each building opened, the streets around it would briefly fill with activity. Moving trucks unloaded furniture, shops decorated their windows for a first wave of customers, restaurants offered discounts to attract residents. Then, slowly, the sound began to fade. Fewer deliveries arrived. Sidewalks emptied. A store might stay open for months before closing, unable to cover rent without steady traffic. The construction noise was replaced by the sound of wind between the towers. The metaphor was hard to miss. What had been a constant roar of growth became a low hum, then a hush. You could walk along a row of brand new apartment blocks and hear your footsteps echo. Public squares that had hosted opening day performances now stood empty, their fountains running for no one. A playground might have bright equipment, but no children. Kangbashi's builders had envisioned a seamless handoff, from construction crews to residents, from cranes to communities. But the gap between the two was longer than anyone admitted at the time. Financing covered the building, but not the slow process of drawing in the people who would make the city function. Unlike a factory or a port, A city cannot run without daily human presence. Still, in the months after each ribbon cutting, officials spoke of the city's inevitable growth. Developers told potential buyers they were investing in the next great urban center. And for a while, the image held. Kangbashi looked complete from above, roads, parks, schools, and cultural landmarks in place. But from the ground, the silence after the construction faded told a different story, a city built for a population that had yet to arrive. When the first census figures came in, they told a story no one in Kangbashi wanted to hear. The city had been built for 1 million people. The official count showed somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 residents, depending on where you drew the boundaries. Streets that could handle rush-hour traffic from an entire metropolis were being crossed by a handful of cars. Entire apartment complexes had only a few lights on at night. For the planners, it was an uncomfortable moment. For foreign media, it was a gift. Reporters from the BBC, Time, and Al Jazeera booked flights to Inner Mongolia. Camera crews rolled into town, hauling tripods and drones. They came looking for images to match the numbers: wide boulevards without pedestrians, playgrounds without children, and public squares where the only movement was the wind pushing dust across the tiles. The term "ghost city" appeared in headlines almost immediately. Articles described Kangbashi as a modern ruin, a place abandoned before it was even occupied. Drone footage swept over empty intersections and rows of identical high-rises, their windows dark. From above, the symmetry of the streets and the size of the buildings gave the city a strange beauty, but it was beauty wrapped in silence. The images spread online, turning Kangbashi into a shorthand for overbuilding and failed ambition. For the people who actually lived there, the label felt wrong. "We're not ghosts," said one shop owner, standing in front of shelves stocked with snacks and bottled drinks. "We live here. We work here. It's just quiet." A taxi driver who had moved from a nearby town put it more sharply. "They come for one day, take pictures of empty streets, and then tell the world no one's here. But they don't come at night when we eat together. They don't see the schools or the markets." Still, the numbers were hard to dispute. Some districts had entire blocks with no permanent residents. In others, the population was so thin that you could recognize people you passed on the street because you had seen them before. Public buses ran their full routes for only a few passengers. The opera house staged events for audiences that barely filled the first rows. The contrast between the infrastructure and the activity was impossible to miss. From the air, Kangbashi looked almost like a stage set. The buildings were clean and unmarked by age. Roads were perfectly paved. Parks were landscaped and ready for picnics that rarely happened. A drone's camera could glide down a perfectly straight avenue and capture both sides of the street without a single vehicle breaking the view. That aerial perfection became the image most outsiders saw. On the ground, the picture changed. Residents knew which restaurants actually had steady customers and which opened only for a few hours a day. They knew the shortcuts between buildings where the wind was less harsh in winter. They knew the sound of the single morning bus that carried workers to the administrative district. Life in Kangbashi was slower, but it was still life. Children rode bikes in schoolyards, neighbors chatted in small grocery stores. Families met in tea houses that stayed warm through the cold months. The label of Ghost City did more than sting. It shaped how outsiders approached the place. Some investors pulled back, worried the name would scare buyers away. Others leaned into it, marketing properties as part of a famous city, hoping notoriety would translate into interest. Local officials pushed back in interviews, pointing to gradual population growth and the long timelines of planned cities. They reminded journalists that other urban projects, like Brasilia in its first years, had also faced early criticism for being underpopulated. But the images were hard to counter. One widely shared news clip showed a reporter standing in the middle of a 10-lane road with no traffic in sight. The shot ran for several seconds without a single car passing. Another clip from a different network showed a shopping mall where the only people visible were the film crew. Even if these moments didn't reflect the full reality, they made for compelling television. Some residents took the attention with a kind of humor. A group of teenagers started filming their own short videos, posing dramatically in empty plazas or pretending to be the last people left on Earth. Others avoided the topic entirely, tired of explaining to visiting relatives that their home wasn't a failure. "It's not empty," one schoolteacher said. "It's just new. Cities don't fill in a year." But no one wants to hear that. The census had not lied. The population was small for a city of its size. And yet on the ground, there were signs of daily routine that didn't fit the ghost city narrative. Street vendors set up stalls in the evening to sell grilled skewers and steamed buns. Delivery drivers crisscrossed the districts on electric bikes, carrying packages from online orders. Municipal workers swept the parks and trimmed the trees. These scenes rarely made it into the foreign coverage. The gap between the drone-shot grandeur and the lived experience became its own story. Aerial footage suggested stillness and abandonment. Walking the streets, you might find a few people going about their business, but in numbers too small to match the size of the stage around them. It was a city caught between image and reality, too large for its current population, too new to be dismissed entirely, and too striking to be ignored. By the time the census shock faded from the headlines, the ghost city name had stuck. Kangbashi was now famous, though not in the way its builders had imagined. The label would follow it for years, woven into every outside description, whether residents liked it or not. For the people living there, life went on at its measured pace, under streets designed for 1 million, in a city the world thought was empty. When Kangbashi opened its doors, the apartments were not priced for the people living in nearby towns and villages. Coal mining had made some families wealthy, but most residents of Ordos still earned modest wages. Many worked in agriculture or small businesses. A new apartment in Kangbashi often cost several times what a typical household could afford. Even those with enough savings hesitated to commit when they saw cheaper housing in older districts that already had shops, schools, and established communities. The problem was made worse by the lack of jobs outside construction and mining. During the building phase, work was easy to find. Carpenters, welders, truck drivers, and concrete crews could stay busy for months at a time. But once the projects were finished, those jobs ended. The government offices in Kangbashi employed some people, but not enough to draw large numbers from other regions. Without factories, technology firms, or service companies, the city struggled to offer stable, long-term employment. People were asked to move to a place where they might have no clear way to make a living. Speculation filled the gap that real demand left behind. Many apartments were bought by investors, some from other provinces, who never intended to live in them. They saw real estate in Kangbashi as a way to store wealth, betting that prices would rise over time. These owners often left units empty to avoid maintenance costs and the wear that comes with renting. At night, entire high-rises could stand dark, even though every unit had an owner. On paper, the city was sold. In reality, it was underoccupied. The city's infrastructure, designed for a population in the hundreds of thousands, opened before there was a base of residents to use it. Schools had more classrooms than students. Bus routes ran through districts where only a few families lived. Large cultural venues, like the Opera House and Stadium, hosted events for sparse audiences. Even the parks and plazas, carefully landscaped and maintained, sat mostly unused, their benches empty on sunny afternoons. The amenities were ready, but the demand had not arrived. For people who tried to make a living from street-level business, the mismatch was personal. One small shop near the central square sold snacks, bottled drinks, and household items. The owner, a man in his 40s, kept the shelves full and the floors clean. Each morning, he unlocked the door and switched on the lights. Some days, a couple of customers would stop in. Other days, no one came at all. He spent long hours leaning on the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. "I thought there would be more people by now," he said once. "I'm just waiting." This pattern was not unique to Kangbashi. In Spain, during the housing boom of the early 2000s, a new city called Ciudad Valdeluz was built outside Madrid. Developers expected it to fill quickly, banking on commuters and rising property values. Apartments sold fast at first, many to investors rather than future residents. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit. Construction halted, the real estate market collapsed, and the buyers who had planned to flip their properties were left with empty units. The streets of Ciudad Valdeluz looked much like Kangbashi's, modern, clean, and quiet to the point of stillness. In both places, the problem was not that the buildings were poorly made or that the layouts were unattractive. The problem was that the market assumptions behind them didn't match the reality on the ground. In Kangbashi, the coal boom created a brief window when money seemed plentiful and future growth felt certain. Prices reflected that optimism, but wages in the surrounding area did not keep pace. In Ciudad Valdeluz, credit was easy and speculation ran high, but once the economy slowed, few people could justify the move. Some families did settle in Kangbashi. They enjoyed the wide streets, new apartments, and lack of traffic. Children had access to modern schools and public spaces were clean. But these benefits were offset by the limited job market and the absence of a larger community. A parent might have to commute to Ordos's older districts for work, leaving much of the day spent outside the city they lived in. Others found the isolation hard to accept, missing the busy markets and social life of more crowded neighborhoods. Over time, the reasons for not coming reinforced each other. High prices kept many locals away. Without more residents, businesses couldn't survive, which meant fewer services for the people who did move in. Investors holding empty apartments had no incentive to lower prices sharply, fearing it would devalue their assets. With few job opportunities, young workers preferred larger cities where careers could grow. Each missing piece, jobs, affordability, services, made the other pieces harder to fix. From a distance, Kangbashi's towers and civic buildings gave the impression of a thriving modern city. Up close, it was clear that life had yet to fill the spaces between them. The shopkeeper by the central square was not alone in his wait. Taxi drivers idled at ranks without passengers. Restaurant owners stood in empty dining rooms after the lunch hour passed. The city had the capacity for 1 million daily routines, but only a fraction of them existed. The lesson from both Kangbashi and Ciudad Valdeluz is that building fast and building big is not enough. People come when they can afford to live there, when they can find work, and when they see others already building lives around them. Without those conditions, a city can be complete in every physical way and still remain unfinished where it matters most. At sunrise, the streets of Kangbashi are almost empty. A few buses roll past, their engines echoing off rows of apartment towers. The sidewalks are wide and clean, but most remain untouched until mid-morning. A man in his 30s leaves his building for work, walking without weaving around crowds. He can hear the sound of his own footsteps and the faint hum of a streetlight switching off as the sun rises higher. He likes the space. There is no rush-hour traffic, no need to fight for parking. His apartment is larger than what he could afford in an older city, and the rent is low compared to what buyers paid years ago. The air feels cleaner than in coal towns nearby, and at night, he can see more stars. He knows his neighbors by name because there are so few of them. Children play in the courtyards without fear of busy roads. But life here also means accepting what is missing. The nearest hospital with full services is in the older part of Ordos, a 30-minute drive away. For certain groceries or clothing, he takes a bus to another district. The city's library is beautiful and quiet, but the selection is limited, and new books arrive slowly. Restaurants open and close in quick cycles, unable to stay afloat with so few customers. In the afternoons, the playground near his building often stands empty. A pair of swings creak in the wind, their chains rattling softly. On weekends, a handful of children come with their parents, but most days it is silent. The sound travels far in the stillness, so far you can hear a basketball bouncing on the other side of the park. He enjoys walking to the central square after dinner. The paths are lined with lights, and the landscaping is well kept. Security guards greet him on their rounds, more as neighbors than officials. It feels safe. Crime is rare, and the streets are so open that strangers are easy to spot. Still, the square was built for crowds that never came. The fountains run, but there is no audience. For nightlife, choices are few. A couple of bars stay open late, but they are quiet. Many evenings end at home, with television or online chats replacing the bustle of cinemas and music venues. Those who want more travel to the older city, where markets stay open and street food vendors work into the night. Some residents have formed small community groups. book clubs, badminton teams, weekly dinners, to make up for the lack of public life. A woman who moved here with her husband 5 years ago says she loves the calm. In Beijing, we were always surrounded by people, she says. Here, I can hear the wind and the birds. I can walk for an hour without crossing paths with anyone. She pauses before adding, but I wish there were more people. Sometimes it feels like we are the last ones left. For children, the emptiness can be a mixed experience. Schools are modern and well-equipped, but class sizes are small, which means fewer friends to play with. One teenager says he likes having space for skateboarding without being told to move, but he misses the feeling of a busy street. When I watch movies about city life, it doesn't look like here, he says. Local shopkeepers adapt as best they can. A small cafe near the administrative district serves a steady but small group of regulars. The owner knows their orders by heart. She keeps the doors open more for them than for profit. We survive because of the people who come every day, she says. If I waited for new customers, I'd be waiting forever. The quiet brings small pleasures. Buses run on time because traffic is light. Public parks are always clean. The Opera House, though rarely full, sells affordable tickets, so residents can see performances without competing for seats. Walking home at night feels safe enough that people leave their bicycles unlocked outside shops. But the same quiet can feel isolating. Without the hum of activity, days can blend together. The man in his 30s sometimes finds himself counting how many people he sees on his walk to the bus stop. The number is usually under 10. He has grown used to the sound of the wind in empty spaces, between towers, across plazas, through playgrounds where swings sway without anyone pushing them. Even in its stillness, Kangbashi has routines. Street cleaners start early, sweeping leaves into neat piles. Delivery drivers make rounds on electric bikes, their horns sharp in the open air. Children ride to school on nearly empty buses. In the evenings, older residents gather in small groups to dance in the squares, moving to music from portable speakers. The sound carries easily, unbroken by traffic or chatter. The man's favorite time is late at night, when the city lights reflect off empty streets. He walks past the library, its glass walls lit from within, and the tall government buildings standing in perfect symmetry. From a distance, it looks like the city the planners imagined, grand, modern, ready for 1 million people. Up close, the silence tells a different story, one that every resident knows by heart. In 2005, Myanmar's government announced its new capital, Naypyidaw. The location was remote, carved from scrubland hundreds of kilometers from Yangon. Official reasons ranged from security concerns to a desire for a more central location. Within a few years, the city had massive government complexes, hotels, and housing for civil servants. The streets were wide, so wide that some could double as emergency runways. At its center stood a grand parliament building, flanked by manicured gardens. Yet when foreign journalists visited, they found emptiness. Civil servants lived in assigned districts, but commercial life lagged. Stores and restaurants struggled to draw enough customers. Outside the government zone, the city felt unfinished, despite completed infrastructure. The sheer width of the roads made the absence of cars more visible. In photos, Naypyidaw's empty boulevards became symbols of a city that looked ready for action but lacked the human density to give it life. The story has echoes in Kangbashi. Both cities were built with speed and scale, both had a clear vision from the top, and both assumed that function would follow form. In Naypyidaw's case, the political decision to move the capital ensured some level of population. The civil service had no choice but to relocate, but it did not guarantee organic growth. For Kangbashi, without that compulsory migration, the gap between capacity and occupancy was even wider. In the United Arab Emirates, Masdar City began with a different kind of ambition. Launched in 2006 near Abu Dhabi, it was designed as a hub for green technology and sustainable living. Plans called for car-free streets, solar-powered infrastructure, and cutting-edge research centers. The vision attracted attention worldwide, with investors, academics, and environmental groups watching closely. The early stages delivered impressive facilities, a research institute, a shaded central plaza, and residential blocks designed to minimize energy use. But as the years passed, the expected influx of companies and residents slowed. High costs, shifts in global energy markets, and changes in project leadership reduced the scope. By the mid-2010s, only a fraction of the projected population lived there. Many buildings stood ready, but the streets between them were quiet. Masdar's challenges mirrored Kangbashi's in unexpected ways. Both were built on the idea that if the infrastructure led, the people would follow. Both underestimated how hard it is to draw sustained populations without a critical mass of jobs, affordable housing, and day-to-day services. In Masdar, the appeal of green living was strong, but the cost of entry was high, and the number of available jobs was small. In Kangbashi, the appeal of a modern, clean city was real, but economic opportunities were limited. In India, Lavasa was marketed as a new kind of hill city, planned, scenic, and designed for a high quality of life. Built in the Western Ghats, it promised schools, resorts, office space, and lakeside homes. Developers drew inspiration from European towns, with colorful facades and waterfront promenades. Sales began in the mid-2000s, and early phases attracted buyers from India's growing middle class. But the project soon hit legal and environmental hurdles. Accusations of land violations, along with disputes over permits, slowed construction. By the early 2010s, many planned areas were incomplete. Visitors reported seeing finished apartments alongside empty plots and half-built hotels. The infrastructure was there in parts, roads, water systems, and some public spaces, but without steady construction, the vision fragmented. Businesses hesitated to open, unsure of when or if the population would grow. Lavasa's story connects to Kangbashi's in the way both cities face the gap between a vision on paper and the realities of timing and trust. In Lavasa, legal battles eroded confidence, scaring off buyers and slowing development. In Kangbashi, the slowdown came from economic factors: coal revenue declining, property speculation keeping units empty, and few industries arriving to support jobs. Both places saw what happens when the momentum of a big project stalls before the community can take root. These cities share patterns despite their different settings. In Naypyidaw, the driver was political strategy. In Masdar, it was technological ambition. In Lavasa, it was the lure of a lifestyle destination. In Kangbashi, it was the promise of economic growth from a resource boom. All assumed that physical infrastructure would be enough to spark rapid population growth. All discovered that buildings, no matter how impressive, cannot create the social and economic web that makes a city feel alive. In Kangbashi, the opera house and library stand as reminders of an expectation that audiences would arrive in large numbers. In Naypyidaw, the 10-lane highways frame the same question: why build for such volume if it will not be used? In Masdar, shaded walkways and solar arrays wait for the bustle of daily life that would make their design most effective. In Lavasa, a lakeside promenade built for strolling crowds often sees only a few visitors at a time. The reasons people choose a city go beyond its buildings. Jobs, affordability, social connections, and cultural activity matter as much as housing stock or street layout. Kangbashi's wide roads and high-rise apartments offer space and order, but without enough work opportunities, many see little reason to relocate. Naypyidaw's Grand Government Quarter guarantees some occupancy but not the diversity of a real urban economy. Masdar's Clean Technology Hub is a draw for specialists but too narrow to support a broad population. Lavasa's scenery and design appeal to second home buyers but cannot sustain a permanent community without economic anchors. Each of these places was shaped by confidence that the future could be built in one decisive move. In Kangbashi, the belief rested on coal wealth and national urbanization trends. In Naypyidaw, it rested on central planning and political will. In Masdar, it rested on the global push for sustainable living. In Lavasa, it rested on the rapid rise of India's middle class. In every case, the gap between the initial push and the reality of daily life proved harder to close than the architects and planners expected. From the air, they all look impressive, organized, modern, and ready. On the ground, the view changes. Streets are clear, but often too clear. Public spaces are finished, but not busy. In the quiet, the sound of wind through empty corridors or across open plazas becomes part of the city's soundtrack. The image of readiness remains, but the sense of a city in motion is still out of reach. Cities like Kangbashi do not rise from the ground without confidence. That confidence can be a strength, but it can also become a trap. In behavioral terms, it is the overconfidence trap, the belief that planners, officials, and investors can see the future more clearly than they actually can. When coal money was pouring into Ordos, it seemed obvious to many that a modern, million-person city would soon be full. The data that might have suggested caution, such as local incomes, migration patterns, or job diversity, was overshadowed by the conviction that success was certain. The planning fallacy played a role as well. This bias leads people to underestimate how long a project will take and to overestimate the demand that will exist when it is finished. In Kangbashi's case, the assumption was that the gap between completion and full occupancy would be short. Officials expected that once the last buildings were painted and the landscaping planted, residents would move in within a few years. What they faced instead was a long pause. The city's infrastructure was ready, but the population grew much more slowly than expected. Part of the drive came from what psychologists call the edifice complex, the urge to build something grand as a marker of achievement, even if the scale outpaces immediate need. Monumental buildings signal power, prosperity, and ambition. In Kangbashi, this impulse produced an opera house, a central library with space for millions of books, and government offices designed to impress. These projects look good in photographs and in official reports, but they do not guarantee the day-to-day life that gives a city its pulse. Survivorship bias reinforced the optimism. In China and elsewhere, many new cities had filled quickly in the past. Pudong in Shanghai transformed from farmland to a major financial district in less than 2 decades. Shenzhen grew from a fishing village to a megacity in a similar time frame. These successes were visible and celebrated, while the failures, places that did not attract enough residents, were less discussed. Planners and investors saw the winners and assumed the same pattern would repeat, without fully accounting for the differences in location, economy, and industry. Behavioral economics also helps explain why investors kept buying apartments in Kangbashi even when demand for living space lagged. Herd behavior plays a part. When people see others investing in something, they often follow, assuming that the group knows something they do not. In the early years, news of rising property prices and quick sales fed the belief that Kangbashi was a safe bet. This effect can be strong even when warning signs are visible. There is also the sunk cost effect. Once developers had bought land and begun construction, walking away would mean admitting a loss. Continuing to build seemed better than stopping, even if market conditions had shifted. For individual investors, holding onto an empty apartment felt safer than selling at a loss, especially in a culture where property is seen as a core form of wealth. This kept many units off the rental market, further slowing population growth. Another factor is optimism bias, the tendency to believe that one's own project will avoid the problems that affect others. Planners could point to reasons why Kangbashi was different: a strong local economy from coal, good transportation links, and national urbanization trends. These points were true, but they did not cancel out the structural issues of high housing costs, limited jobs, and heavy reliance on one industry. Optimism bias can make these issues seem temporary or minor, even when they are significant. In megaprojects, there is also political pressure. Large, visible projects can boost careers. Success can mean promotions or national attention. Failure is often framed as a matter of timing, not concept. This encourages a focus on completing the build rather than on ensuring demand matches supply. In Kangbashi, finishing the city's core was a political victory in itself, regardless of how many people moved in immediately afterward. These psychological factors interact. Overconfidence feeds the planning fallacy. Survivorship bias strengthens optimism bias. The edifice complex justifies ambitious designs that appeal to prestige. Herd behavior encourages continued investment even when the fundamentals are weak. The result is a city that looks ready for a future that may take decades to arrive. The same patterns can be seen in other large-scale projects. In Naypyidaw, the government's certainty that the capital move would succeed led to an oversized road network. In Masdar City, faith in the global demand for green tech drove construction ahead of actual tenant commitments. In Lavasa, confidence in rising incomes and lifestyle demand kept the project going despite mounting legal trouble. Each case shows how cognitive biases can push a project past the point where a slower, more measured approach might have been wiser. In real estate and urban planning, these biases are amplified by the visibility of physical progress. A half-built tower feels like momentum, even if the economic case for finishing it is weakening. A completed boulevard feels like success, even if it is empty. Once something tangible exists, it becomes harder to question whether it should have been built at that scale in the first place. Investors, too, face pressures beyond pure logic. Social proof, the idea that if many are buying, it must be safe, works strongly in property markets. Friends, colleagues, and family members buying in Kangbashi added to the sense that it was the right move. Loss aversion made them reluctant to sell at a lower price, which would lock in a financial loss and a symbolic one. Holding the property and waiting for better times felt less painful, even if it meant years without income from the asset. Understanding these psychological patterns does not make them easier to avoid. The promise of building a new city taps into deep instincts about growth, progress, and permanence. It offers visible proof of ambition and the belief that the future can be shaped by will and design. Kangbashi, like other ambitious urban projects, became a stage for those instincts to play out, its wide streets and empty plazas both the product of high confidence and a reminder of its limits. In the last few years, Kangbashi has begun to stir with new energy. The population has grown well beyond its early days when only a few thousand people lived among its wide streets and towering apartment blocks. The local government moved its administrative center into the district, and several well-regarded schools relocated here. This gave families and teachers a reason to settle, and the change shows in the daily life around the schools. Cafes have opened nearby, and small grocery stores now have regular customers. On street corners, neighbors greet each other where once the quiet seemed unbroken. Officials have also worked to make Kangbashi a cultural and tourism destination. Festivals, concerts, and open-air performances now take place in public squares. On weekends, the fountains run to music, drawing families to the civic center. Museums and parks, once almost empty, now see steady visitors. Guided tours bring in people curious about the city's unusual history and its striking architecture. Infrastructure has improved alongside these efforts. New bus routes link Kangbashi more directly with other districts, and streetlights now stay on later into the evening. Public areas that once felt far apart now seem more connected, partly because there are more people walking between them. Despite these changes, Kangbashi is still far from its original goal of 1 million residents. Many apartment towers remain only partly occupied, and some plazas are larger than the crowds they host. But the silence that once defined the city has eased. There is movement now, light but noticeable. Residents are quick to point out the difference. A teacher says, "When I walk to school, I pass more neighbors. I know some faces now." A shopkeeper near the government offices explains, "A few years ago, I watched cars pass without anyone inside. Now I see families heading home. Business isn't booming, but it has a rhythm." On weekends, parents sit beside the fountains, talking while children play nearby. The sound of laughter, though still gentle, settles into the public spaces as if it belongs. Tourism has returned, enough to keep several hotels and guest houses running. Visitors come to see the grand public buildings, the broad avenues, and the mix of modern design and open space. The city's parks and cultural sites have become part of the draw, offering a setting that feels both expansive and calm. Today, Kangbashi is still underpopulated, but it no longer matches the image of an abandoned ghost city. The changes are gradual, but they are visible in everyday life. People sharing sidewalks, children playing in the squares, music drifting from evening events. The fountains no longer run for no one. They run for someone. In the spaces where wind once filled the air, there are now footsteps, voices, and the steady growth of a community finding its own pace. The city remains quiet, but the quiet feels different now, less like absence, more like a pause between chapters. A city can be drawn in perfect lines on paper. It can be measured in kilometers of roads, square meters of apartments, and seats in stadiums. But numbers and blueprints do not give it breath. Kangbashi shows what happens when the physical shape arrives long before the organic forces that make it live. Without enough jobs, affordable homes, or the pull of an existing community, the streets stay empty, no matter how well they are paved. Urban planning works best when it grows from what people already need. Cities thrive when housing matches incomes, when industries provide steady work, and when services grow alongside population. Kangbashi's towers, plazas, and public buildings were ready years before those other elements could catch up. The lesson is that you cannot substitute architecture for economy or community. A plan on paper is a skeleton. Without the flow of daily life, it does not move. This is not a mistake limited to city building. In business, large projects often fail when they rely too much on vision and not enough on demand. A product can be sleek, well-funded, and launched with fanfare, but without customers ready to buy it, the launch falls flat. In policy, an initiative can be passed into law with strong backing, but without the resources or conditions for people to use it, the effect is limited. The pattern is the same. Supply without a driver for demand leaves something beautiful, but still. There is also the matter of scale. Large projects carry prestige, but scale multiplies risk. A small miscalculation in a neighborhood development can be fixed by adjusting the next block. A miscalculation in a whole city means empty districts and stalled growth. Kangbashi's early years show how hard it is to correct when the investment is already locked in concrete and steel. This is why gradual expansion, though less dramatic, can be more resilient. It allows for pauses, adjustments, and a better match between infrastructure and the people it serves. The metaphor of a city as a living organism is apt. You can assemble the bones, roads, buildings, utilities, but that alone does not make it breathe. Life comes from movement, interaction, and shared purpose. People create the circulation. Work, schools, markets, and culture become its organs. Without those, the city remains an impressive structure without a heartbeat. Kangbashi's slow change in recent years shows that breath can arrive late. Schools moved in, offices opened, and families followed. Cultural events gave people reasons to meet in public spaces. Shops began to find regular customers. None of this happened because the skyline was complete. It happened because the underlying conditions began to align. The skeleton started to move because there was now something to carry. For policymakers, the warning is clear. Ambition must be balanced by patience. Building ahead of demand can work, but only if there is a realistic plan for creating that demand. For investors, the caution is to look beyond the renderings. Ask what will draw people to live, work, and spend their time in the new space. For planners, the reminder is to think of cities not as finished objects, but as environments that must adapt and grow with their inhabitants. The changes in Kangbashi's soundscape tell the story in miniature. In the early years, the air carried the clatter of construction, jackhammers, cranes, the low rumble of trucks. Then came a hollow phase, when wind was the loudest presence and the echo of footsteps seemed too sharp. Now, in certain corners, the wind has competition. Children's laughter spills from playgrounds. A bus brakes at the curb and passengers step down. A cafe door opens and closes, the murmur of voices slipping out before it shuts again. These are not yet the sounds of a crowded city, but they are the sounds of one beginning to live. Kangbashi remains far from the million residents once imagined for it. Wide streets still outsize the number of cars they hold. Some apartment towers keep more windows dark than lit, yet the quiet now has texture. It holds the small noises that mean presence. They are reminders that the hardest part of building is not the concrete or the steel. It is creating the reason for people to be there at all. Sometimes the skyline is the easiest thing to raise. The harder work is filling the space beneath it with a life worth staying for.